Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Femme Friday, November 12th. November 12th. Oh my God, we're almost into 2022. Wow. Okay, so I say that just because it kind of sunk in that it has been almost a year since Joe Biden has gotten elected. It's been a year since we defeated Donald Trump, and yet Donald Trump still is playing an active role, albeit with less regulation since he's not in the presidency, in building a movement, raising money, and organizing his extreme far-right agenda, fascistic agenda. I think, a few years ago when he was running in, say, 2015, and we said things like, there are hints of fascism, people said, oh, you have Trump derangement syndrome, you're too obsessed, this is a cable news thing. Except sometimes you can have two things that are true at the same time. Yes, he's a cable news thing. Yes, they loved making money off of him. Yes, some people did have Trump derangement syndrome, but simultaneously, the guy has built something. Whether he was conscious of it or not, he's riding the wave now, and the Republicans are riding the wave. They have planted seeds, and now these seeds are popping up with an infrastructure that has been built and funded by the Koch brothers, the Tea Party, the Heritage Foundation, all of these different organizations out there, and of course, the media. And so you now see far right-wing candidates sprouting up all over the country. And they're spreading their message, and they're angry, and they're hateful, and they threaten to kill leftists. They're on the streets, they're Proud Boys, they're Boogaloo Boys, they're gun-toting women who would love to take on AOC on the floor of the Congress. They're spreading hate online and not being held accountable. They're spreading hate on the streets. They're supporting Kyle Rittenhouse. They're calling us all rioters. They're creating race wars and culture wars. They're attacking women, and they're getting away with it. And they're getting away with it because the Democrats do not exist. And where they do exist, say the presidency, the Senate, and Congress, they really stand down. So if we move 2 years from now, if we're sitting here on election night, which will literally be 2 years from now, and we look on election night and see that we lost the Senate, and we lost Congress, and we lost the presidency, I want you to start thinking about this right now. What does that mean? How far right? How much further right can we get? Democrats have basically surrendered democracy over to Republicans because these Republicans are getting elected, and they're using every loophole possible, pass through Democratic Senate or pass through, Democratic Congress or not, because Democrats don't wage a war on the ground and don't have parties in every state that are fully operational and funded, recruiting candidates. We are not doing everything we can. And 4 years from now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, we shall look back and say, what could we have done? Well, guess what? This is the moment where we could do something. And I'm not saying that we're able to move Nancy Pelosi and awaken her or Joe Biden and awaken him. But what I can say is if you're a progressive, if you are from the working class, if you are a Starbucks employee in Buffalo or an Amazon worker in Staten Island or in California or a nurse organizing in Buffalo, Buffalo's got a lot of news this week, you should maybe run for office. Because one thing that is very hard for Republicans to fight against is when working class people have a union background and lean into that union background, run. And they run against people like Chris Jacobs, who's in New York 27. He's a Republican. He's an oligarch. The average income in New York 27 is around $60,000. You slice out one little part of that district, it's probably down to $35,000 a year. Chris Jacobs is not representative of that part of Buffalo. So wouldn't it be great to have a Starbucks worker run against him? Talk about what they're facing in their community? I think that's how you defeat Republicans. Or if you're in Arizona, you lean into the fact that you're one of the teachers who organized and was part of the Red State Rebellion. You run against some fascist twerp who was part of the insurrection, might resonate with voters. Voters love their teachers. So we got to start thinking about how we creep into power and not rely on Democrats. We can shout at Democrats, we can get mad at them, we can even pressure them in unique moments. It's good to pressure Joe Manchin, it's good to pressure Kirsten Sinema, but we got to pressure Chuck Schumer. He is not doing everything he can. And clearly Joe Biden isn't either. All right, we have a wonderful show today. It is Femme Friday. We'll be right back with Akela Lacy. You know what helps me when I'm traveling and I can't sleep, dealing with time zones and aches and pains because I'm not working out and I'm eating really crappy food, and so I'm getting old basically. That's bottom line is I'm getting to that age where I can't get away with doing the stuff that I used to do. When I was a traveling reporter, I did not have these aches and pains, and now I do. All those years on the ground covering movements and traveling the country for Bernie and then for TYT and covering Trump rallies. Well, it's caught up with me because it's very hard for me to sleep, and it's very hard for me to sleep without aches and pains. But luckily, Sunset Lake CBD has come to the rescue. Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that ships craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont to your door. And they have all types of products for everybody to help with your stress, your aches, your pains, your sleep. There are tinctures with melatonin now, so they help you go to sleep with the melatonin as an expert and stay asleep with the CBD. It's a highly concentrated dose of both of them, and it really helps you have a deep, intense sleep that I monitor with my sleep monitor here. So they took this farm that was a Ben & Jerry's farm, and they decided to diversify it and make it a premium hemp farm. When you support Sunset Lake CBD, you are supporting sustainable agriculture that enhances rural economies in Vermont. And on top of that all, they're a majority employee-owned and that's a hard thing to say, majority employee-owned company. They pay their workers a minimum wage of $15 an hour and up, and they support independent media like our show, The Nomiki Show, The Majority Report, those guys, and David Pakman. So definitely, if you have a chance, go check out sunsetlakecbd.com. You can get 20% off of your entire order. Go to sunsetlakecbd.com. You'll get 20% off of your entire order. And I think there's like this thing right now where they might be offering another deal. You got to go check it out. But they've got all sorts of products from Keef, Smalls, flowers, lotions, tinctures, dog biscuits that chill your dog out. I know my dog needs it. But go check it out, sunsetlakecbd.com, and get 20% off of your order when you type in NOMI, N-O-M-I. Be right back. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. I'm not sure if you've been following all the politics in New York. There's been a lot of developments in the last few months, to say the least. There's definitely a tectonic shift happening in New York politics with Governor Cuomo having to step down, and of course, plenty of opportunities for folks to rise up and run for governor, or attorney general, and other seats that are potentially going to be opening up. It's also this was a big year where the city council all ran in New York City, and we of course elected a new mayor. With that being said, I'm sure you saw what happened in Buffalo with India Walton. So how does that relate to our next story? Well, there's a man named Jay Jacobs who is in charge of the Democratic Party in New York. The Democratic Party was and I say was because this is important, was essentially a utility of Governor Cuomo. He appointed people. Some people tried to break through and get elected to the committee positions. And there are a few progressives here and there, but it's been very, very hard to break through the Democratic Party in New York. So much so that some Democrats who aren't even that progressive, just don't interact with the state Democratic Party. And part of the reason is it's New York. You know, there's not really a Republican Party. And if there is, it's focusing on upstate races. So when I was on the Unity Reform Commission, as you guys know, this occurred, in 2017 through 18. We toured around the country and we talked about how we could fix the National Democratic Party, which is also made up of state Democratic parties. And one thing we learned really quickly was that New York State has the second to lowest voter turnout, had the second to lowest voter turnout in the country, just above Mississippi, a red state. Or excuse me, Louisiana. Oof, I should know this by heart at this point. So why did New York State? Well, it turns out they had all these voter restrictive laws. When the New York State Democrats won back the Senate, I'm not saying the party, when folks in a coalition took on the IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference that was caucusing with Republicans, which was a foil for Governor Cuomo not to have to veto progressive legislation because it would never get through the Senate. But when the Senate was really, truly controlled by Democrats, when progressives beat the IDC members, they were able to pass a few sets of laws to open up access, consolidate primaries, make it a more democratic state. However, there were a few things left. And despite the Democratic National Committee pressuring the state Democratic Party to issue some of these reforms, despite trying to push them through the legislature, was not able to happen. Well, there were 3 ballot items this last election that could have improved that. Turns out the Democratic Party, the state Democratic Party, put no money into supporting these ballot items, and they did not pass. But they did focus a lot of their attention on a write-in campaign to defeat India Walton. Our next guest is Akela Lacy, friend of the show. She's a politics reporter at the Intercept and she was an inaugural Addie Barkan reporting fellow. And she did a great story on this situation, the ballot items and redistricting and prison gerrymandering, which is a much deeper analysis of why this kind of thing happened. So welcome to the show, Akela.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Akela, this is a civil rights issue. It's not just that it's something that Democrats didn't back. It's that at the root of it, it's restricting voters from voting, and it's enabling really horrible gerrymandering that disenfranchises folks, specifically people of color. So can you tell us what you discovered when you started to dig in?
Yeah, so a lot of Democrats were disappointed after elections in New York because there were these ballot measures that we're talking about. There were 3 in particular. One that would have reformed the redistricting process, another would have allowed same-day voter registration, and then the other would have ended prison gerrymandering in New York. At the congressional level, there's already a state law that prohibits prison gerrymandering in state legislative redistricting. This would have codified that in the Constitution and then extended it to congressional. But people were really surprised because these are issues that poll really popularly with Democrats everywhere, not just in New York, but particularly in New York and in New York City, which is a heavily blue city. To your point, a lot of people pointed their blame at Jay Jacobs, chair of the New York State Democratic Party, who seemed to have been, he was going out, on different in different outlets and making different comments in the weeks leading up to the race. One of the most famous of which now was him comparing India Walton to David Duke, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, saying basically Democrats shouldn't have to endorse any candidate. What if it was somebody like David Duke? The interesting thing there is that Democrats have often strong-armed candidates into backing their endorsed candidate. And so the irony is that, the undertones of what Jacobs was saying is something that a lot of progressives would agree with, but the content of what he was saying was pretty offensive and also kind of ridiculous because the person running against Walton was working with the Republican Party. But all that to say that Jacobs was very focused on this. Later, after the elections, he told media that the party didn't spend any money promoting any of these 3 ballot initiatives. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party and New York State Republicans spent more than $3 million opposing the initiatives, framing them as things that would, contribute to widespread voter fraud. And they had a statewide campaign where they were going around touring and talking to people about how bad these proposals would be. You can tell the impact that had because inside New York City, a lot of people did vote for it. It wasn't overwhelmingly no votes, but a lot of people left it blank. And that is an indicator that people didn't understand what they were voting for. In other boroughs that are a little bit more conservative leaning, it did fail, which is not all that surprising. But I think to your earlier point about turnout, had Democrats invested any money in this whatsoever, we're not talking about like more money. They said they spent $0 on it. I think the state party had done some other efforts to promote it, but nowhere near the counter campaign that we saw from the Republican side. Had that been the case, then they would have had a chance of passing. They probably would have passed. And so we're in a situation now where none of these things are going to go into effect. And while Democrats at the national level are sort of debating the life expectancy of the rest of their agenda items, which include voting rights reform, there's a lot of questions about how successful those things will be.
What were the margins? Just so folks have a sense.
Yeah, so let me pull them up. I have a link here. Give me one second. So in New York City, the measure, hang on, give me 2 seconds. Three counties had people vote more than 50% in favor of this proposal. In New York City, I think it was like 40% to the people who didn't pass or didn't vote at all or voted no. Here we go. So 48.5% of voters said no on the first proposal. 38% said yes, and 11% left the question blank. Statewide, at least half of voters rejected the second two proposals. But again, I think it says between 17 and 27% of people left the question blank.
So this is insane. So the Republicans, you said that they toured around certain areas. What do they do when they tour around? Was it door to door? And this is, by the way, like just to put this in context, the Republican Party is, if the Democrats are non-operational, the Republicans are even more so.
Yeah. So they basically had like a bus tour. Like they went around to areas, like predominantly conservative areas in New York, basically doing like stumping for, against these proposals. I don't think they were necessarily going door to door, but they had, I think some of it was door to door. Some of it was just like holding different events and sort of speaking engagements. But it was called the Just Say No Tour. And it was, they reached 40 different counties in 10 days. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say whether that necessarily was extremely effective or if it was more effective just because there was no counter programming,
That's interesting because it's like, this is actually a great symbol. That alone is such a great symbol of the problem that we're facing today. You have a Republican Party who sometimes puts a lot of money into things and sometimes doesn't put that much money into things. But if the Democrats do absolutely nothing, we lose. I mean,
right.
That's it. That's literally it. That's like the entire nation. That's why we're in this situation. Whether it's state parties that don't have money and aren't recruiting candidates, and the Koch brothers who've been able to push their narrative and get people into the legislatures and basically attack women's rights and civil rights. Here is that example. They can't do much in New York because of the Senate, but they were able to block something. And wow. So the civil rights groups have been very vocal about this and angry. What do you think is going to happen now? And what are they saying they want to happen?
So, a lot of groups are still pushing, at the national level for the Biden administration to pass the bulk of its agenda that it's been trying to do since, for the last 11 months. But B, they're hoping that, the backlash that we're seeing among some punditry and some elected officials to Democratic results in, across the board in elections, not even just in New York, won't create a situation like we saw in the 2020 midterms where a bunch of moderate Democrats were blaming the progressive wing of the party for trying to respond to calls for police reform, et cetera. and then ended up derailing a lot of those things, even things that had popular support in the past. So now I think people are concerned. AOC had a thread about this the other day, basically that the backlash that we're seeing, people blaming critical race theory in Virginia, and saying, Abigail Spanberger telling the New York Times that Biden wasn't elected to be FDR. These kinds of things will inhibit party members who might have been sympathetic to these things before from, really pushing as hard as they have been to advance parts of the agenda, including, massive changes to voting rights legislation, things like expanding Medicare, extending the child tax credit, all of these things that are very popular. So people are worried that, unfortunately, the disinformation campaign from Republicans will eventually derail Democrats' agenda rather than changing the way that Democrats campaign on these things. Yeah.
And this is coming from civil rights groups in particular?
So sorry, I'm talking a little bit more about like Democrats and progressive groups, but I think I haven't spoken specifically to civil rights groups about the voting for the voting rights aspect of all of this. But I think generally, I think people are, I don't know. It's sort of like they've been asking for the same things for so long. We've been in a situation where we've been told that these things are going to be on the table, and then they're constantly in sort of this messaging battle with Republicans. So, there are groups that want, there are groups. I think people have different sort of strategies about how they would want Biden to respond to those things. But I think the bottom line is that they're just like, okay, so when are we, like, if it's not going to happen now, is it going to happen in a bill later down the road? The administration has suggested that things that don't make it into the spending package, they'll try to do in other packages or other bills, later down the line. So the question is like, how many things will get pushed, off into those buckets?
Let's go back to Jacobs for a second, because there have been whispers about him being challenged or calls for him to resign on the Indy Walton aspect. Not only did he, as the Democratic Party chair who was appointed by Governor Cuomo, let's remind folks, but he's from Long Island, and he's a party chair on Long Island, and Long Island was completely ravaged. All Democrats lost, literally all Democrats, sitting Democrats lost their seats because he's distracted. So not only does he have a problem at the state level, but he has a problem locally now. Is there actual movement about him resigning? And the party structure is still, the members are still, for the most part, Cuomo people. Like, if he resigns, they're just going to replace him with another face.
Yeah. So there are, I think the Nassau Democratic County chair called on Jacobs to resign, not even over the Walton stuff, about all this stuff that happened. AOC was tweeting about it. Alessandra Biaggi was tweeting about it. So, sort of not anyone surprising necessarily is calling on him to resign. I don't think that he necessarily will. But again, to your point, Jacobs has sort of tried to recast himself. Well, I don't know how much effort he's put into recasting himself since Cuomo left office, but this was Cuomo's number two guy. Like, this is not somebody who has ever been sort of middle of the road, sympathetic to progressive causes. He was right there with the IDC stuff. He was right there alongside Cuomo up until the last possible second that he could have jumped off of the burning truck or whatever you want to call it. So, I think if Democrats in New York it's interesting because the criticisms that we're hearing from national Democrats about what happened in the elections are not the same things that we're hearing from New York State Democrats. And so,
which is always the case, by the way, just to remind folks, the dynamics are super different in terms of how that plays out.
Right. And so in New York, it's, progressives are going to continue to call on Jacobs to resign. Again, I don't know how effective that will be, but we have this split screen of, in other states, they're saying, we're doing too much. We're going too far left. We're not supposed to be FDR. And in New York, the anger is actually that which, it'd be interesting if this was reflected in the rest of the country, but the general consensus is that the party was at fault here because they didn't do enough, and that had people had all the information, then they would have been able to pass all of these things and make significant changes. New York has also been one of the states that has been able to, once all these progressives were elected, in 2018 and 2020, they've been able to fast track so many pieces of the progressive agenda. And so seeing something like this fall so short of what it could have been makes it a lot easier for them to figure out who to blame. But I think, it's if we're talking about sort of like national political strategy, how what would the impact have been had these things passed in New York on 2022 or something like that, and would that have changed the conversation that we were seeing sort of in other national other sort of like debriefs from election day? I think then the conversation would be a lot different. And probably a little bit more productive, but yeah.
It's interesting. It's like the last few years, really since the IDC and that campaign against the IDC, Trump too, folks are waking up to what the lack of progress that New York has had, despite the fact that it is overwhelmingly Democratic. And really it is, as you're saying, very progressive. I mean, whether it's progressive New York City or progressive, Buffalo, there's a lot of, working class folks who you look at that map of where Bernie won, and you see a New York and compare it to districts that have been won since then that probably Bernie didn't win in 2016 in the primary. It's fascinating. I mean, it's really like to see people wake up to the state of affairs in New York and just how bad it's been. I don't even know if it's like folks we're moving too fast. It's like we're catching up. We're catching up with basic rights, but there's an appetite for it. Although then you look at someone like Eric Adams, who I think is playing to a national audience a little bit more than a New York City audience.
I don't even know who Eric Adams is playing to. He's playing to like...
He's a weirdo, man.
That guy is like such a strange bird. But the thing, to a point that you just made, about Democrats waking up, it's interesting because, it's like two diametrically opposed things happened in New York, and people are still using them both to make these points about the national party and what we should and shouldn't do. But with Walton, she actually carried working class, like the poorest neighborhoods or the poorest wards in Buffalo. The majority Black and brown poor wards in Buffalo went for Walton.
Right.
Brown carried white affluent districts where a lot of conservative and Republican voters were registered. All these results are still unofficial, but there's a guy who I don't know his name, but his Twitter handle is Rust Belt Geo, and we follow each other, and he's great. He's been making all these he's like a data scientist. He's been making these fantastic maps about the Buffalo results, and you're not hearing that in the punditry about why Brown came back after he won, the write-in campaign, where, all you're hearing is that these policies alienate the working class communities that Democrats are trying to appeal to. And that's just not the case, in the Walton race. So I think, that's it.
No, I think, this is, it's like, we're just like repeating ourselves over and over again every cycle. Like, no, if Democrats appeal to working class people, if Democrats talked about these issues, it's not about critical race theory. It's not about wokeism. It's about talk about class. And they're allergic to talking about class. And they'll distract by saying, we're getting too woke, but it's about, no, class is intersectional, obviously. And if you want to deal with issues that have to paint a picture in terms of CRT, it's like, if you want to deal with these institutional issues, if you want to deal with deep-seated racism in this country, not being reductionist, but you actually have to also talk about class and, do it in conjunction with each other. Fascinating. Akilah, thank you for joining us. You're the best.
Thank you for having me.
The Nomiki Show. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.